Imagine taking your mother to a nice restaurant, only for a waiter to treat her like she didn't belong, just because of how she looked. That's exactly what happened to James and his elderly mother, Miss Eleanor. The moment they walked in, the waiter's attitude shifted. He greeted other guests with a smile, but when he looked at Miss Eleanor, his face twisted with disdain. He ignored her, delayed their service, and even made rude remarks under his breath. But what he didn't realize, the woman he was mocking had more power than he could ever imagine. What would you have done in James's place? Let us know in the comments before we continue. James had always admired his mother, Miss Eleanor. She was a woman of quiet strength, carrying herself with grace no matter where she went. At 76 years old, she had lived through struggles that would break most people, yet she remained kind and dignified. That evening, James wanted to celebrate her. He took her to one of the finest restaurants in town, a place known for its exclusivity and elite guests. He wanted to give her an experience she deserved. But from the moment they arrived, something felt off. The waiter barely looked at Miss Eleanor. While he greeted other guests with warmth, his attitude toward her was different, cold, dismissive, uninterested. James noticed it immediately, but Miss Eleanor, ever patient, simply smiled. As they sat down, the waiter barely acknowledged them. He handed the menu only to James, as if his mother wasn't even there. When Miss Eleanor asked for water, he nodded but never brought it. James clenched his jaw, watching as the waiter cheerfully served the other tables while ignoring his mother. His patience was wearing thin. Then, as Miss Eleanor politely reminded him about her order, the waiter smirked and muttered something under his breath. James heard it. And that's when he decided this wasn't going to slide. Did he hear that right? The waiter had just muttered something under his breath, but it was loud enough for James to catch. He turned to his mother, Miss Eleanor, but she didn't react. She had probably chosen to ignore it, just like she had ignored every other slight, every dismissive glance, every moment of disrespect. James wasn't about to do the same. Still, he took a deep breath. Maybe he misheard. Maybe the waiter was just having a bad day. Maybe... Then it happened again. The waiter came back to their table, and this time there was no mistaking it. He sighed loudly, shaking his head as he placed the water down. "You sure you two can afford to eat here?" James felt a slow burn in his chest. His mother's expression didn't change, but he could see the sadness in her eyes. Not anger, not shock, just that same quiet acceptance, like she had seen this 1,000 times before. James clenched his jaw. "Excuse me?" The waiter smirked. "I was just saying, this place isn't really, budget-friendly. I wouldn't want you two to feel uncomfortable." Miss Eleanor's hand gently rested on James's wrist. He knew what she was doing. She was telling him to let it go. But not this time. James leaned forward. "And what makes you think we can't afford it?" The waiter chuckled, looking him up and down. "Relax, I didn't mean anything by it. I just like to give people a heads up before they order something they can't pay for." A few guests nearby turned their heads, sensing the tension. Some whispered, others just pretended not to hear. James exhaled, keeping his voice calm. "That's funny, because I don't see you giving that heads up to anyone else in here." The waiter shrugged. "Well, sir, I like to be honest with my customers." James felt his blood boil, but he didn't raise his voice. He wouldn't give this man the satisfaction of thinking he had power over them. Instead, he smiled. "Good," James said. "Then let's be honest. Why do you assume we can't afford this restaurant?" The waiter blinked. The smirk twitched slightly. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Miss Eleanor finally spoke, her voice soft yet steady. "Young man, I have been dining in restaurants far finer than this long before you were even born." The waiter's smirk faded. James wasn't done. "Let's try something. How about you bring us the most expensive dish on the menu? In fact, bring two. And while you're at it, call your manager over." The color drained from the waiter's face. "Sir, that's not necessary." "No, I think it is," James replied. "Unless you have a problem with serving paying customers." The manager arrived within seconds, sensing something was wrong. "Is everything okay here?" James smiled. "I'd love to ask your waiter the same thing." The manager turned to the waiter. "What happened?" The waiter hesitated. Nothing, sir. Just a misunderstanding." James shook his head. "No misunderstanding. He just wanted to make sure we could afford to eat here. Apparently, we look like the kind of people who don't belong." The manager paled. "That's not our policy, sir." James leaned back in his chair. "Really? Because judging by your waiter's confidence, it sure seems like it happens a lot." The restaurant had gone quiet. Other customers were listening now. Some looked embarrassed, a few uncomfortable, but nobody was laughing anymore. James turned to his mother. "Mom, do you want to tell them who you are?" Miss Eleanor sighed, setting her napkin down. "I was hoping I wouldn't have to." She turned to the manager and spoke calmly. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am one of the founding investors in this restaurant." The silence was deafening. The waiter's face went pale. His hands trembled as he realized the weight of what he had just done. Miss Eleanor continued, "I believed in this restaurant's vision. I put my money into it because I wanted to support a business that valued quality and community." She turned to the waiter. "But I see that somewhere along the way, that vision got lost." The manager looked mortified. "Ma'am, I had no idea. I am so deeply sorry." Miss Eleanor gave him a small smile. "I'm not the one you should apologize to." The waiter swallowed hard, turning to her. "Ma'am, I didn't know. If you had known who I was," she interrupted, "you would have treated me differently. That is exactly the problem." James folded his arms. "So tell me, manager, what happens now?" The entire restaurant was watching. The manager cleared his throat. "This is unacceptable. I assure you, this is not how we treat our guests. I will be addressing this matter immediately." James nodded. "That's a start. But we're not just talking about my mother. We're talking about every other guest who has walked in here and been treated like they don't belong." The manager lowered his head. "You're right." Miss Eleanor stood, smoothing out her dress. "I'd like to make one thing clear before I leave. I do not invest in businesses that do not respect their customers." The meaning behind her words was clear. If things didn't change, her money would go elsewhere. James smiled. "We'll take our dinner to go." As they walked out, the restaurant was silent. Guests who had once ignored them now stared with wide eyes. Some even whispered apologies. The same waiter who had treated Miss Eleanor like she was beneath him now looked like he wanted to disappear. And for the first time that evening, James felt at peace. Because respect wasn't about money, it wasn't about power. It was about character. And tonight, one thing was clear. His mother had more of it than that waiter ever would. The restaurant was silent. Every guest had turned to watch as James stood his ground, calling out the waiter for his disrespect. The manager had rushed over, apologizing for what had happened. But James wasn't interested in empty apologies. He wanted accountability. Miss Eleanor sat quietly, her expression unreadable. But James knew his mother. He could tell she was hurt. She had experienced things like this before, but tonight it wasn't going unnoticed. The waiter shifted uncomfortably, avoiding James's stare. "Sir, I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a misunderstanding. James tilted his head. A misunderstanding? The manager cleared his throat. I assure you, sir, this isn't how we treat our guests. James smirked. No? Then why did it happen? The waiter was sweating now, his face pale. I didn't know who she was. And there it was. Miss Eleanor finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. So, if I had been someone else, someone who looked wealthy enough, you would have treated me with respect. The waiter had no answer. James shook his head. That's the problem. You didn't see a person. You saw an assumption. The weight of those words sank into the room. The people who had stayed silent earlier now shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Some glanced at Miss Eleanor with guilt in their eyes. The manager stepped forward. Ma'am, on behalf of our staff, I deeply apologize. This behavior is unacceptable, and I assure you it will be addressed. Miss Eleanor gave him a small smile. I appreciate that. But an apology means nothing without change. The manager hesitated. Of course. We will take immediate action. James folded his arms. And what does that mean? The manager opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no real answer. James let out a short laugh. That's what I thought. The waiter was visibly trembling now. I never meant to be rude. I just assumed. That's the problem. Miss Eleanor interrupted. You assumed. She turned to the manager. Tell me, what kind of training do you give your staff? The manager fumbled for words. We, ensure all employees provide excellent customer service. Miss Eleanor nodded. Then I suppose this young man skipped that lesson? The tension was unbearable. James decided to finish it. Look, my mother doesn't need an apology. She needs to know this won't happen again, to her or anyone else. The manager nodded quickly. I understand, sir. We will make sure of that. James smiled. Good. Because I'd hate to think that my mother invested in a place that doesn't align with her values. The manager's eyes widened. Invested? James nodded. That's right. My mother, Miss Eleanor Whitmore, is one of your founding investors. A gasp rippled through the room. The guests, who had ignored Miss Eleanor, now stared at her in shock. The waiter turned as white as a sheet. The manager's mouth fell open. I had no idea. That much is clear, Miss Eleanor said with a smile. The waiter opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had insulted not just a customer, but one of the very people responsible for the restaurant's success. Miss Eleanor sighed. I came here tonight just to enjoy a meal with my son. But instead, I was reminded that respect is still something people think should be earned based on appearances. The entire restaurant felt her words. James leaned forward. So, tell me, manager, what are you going to do about it? The manager swallowed hard. We will be implementing mandatory training to ensure this never happens again. And as for our waiter, we will be discussing his future with us. The waiter looked like he wanted to disappear. Please, ma'am, I didn't know. Miss Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Then, instead of anger, she simply said, I hope next time you don't need to know someone to treat them with respect. James grinned. That's fair. The manager nodded. We will make this right, ma'am. You have my word. Miss Eleanor stood up. I'll hold you to that. With that, she and James walked toward the exit. The entire restaurant, once filled with quiet judgment, was now silent for a different reason, and as they left, James saw something he hadn't seen when they walked in, respect in the eyes of those around them. Because respect wasn't about money, it wasn't about power, it was about character. And tonight, they had reminded everyone in that room exactly what that meant. The same woman who had been ignored, belittled, and treated like she didn't belong was one of the very people who had helped build this place. The manager's mouth fell open. I had no idea. That much is clear, Miss Eleanor said with a small smile, her voice calm but firm. The waiter looked like he wanted to disappear. His arrogant smirk was gone. His hands fidgeted, his breathing uneven. Ma'am, I didn't know. If you had known, you would have treated me differently, Miss Eleanor interrupted. And that is the real problem. James folded his arms. Let's be honest. If my mother were wearing expensive jewelry, if she had arrived in a limousine, if she looked like someone you wanted to impress, you would have treated her with respect from the moment she walked in. The waiter lowered his head, unable to argue. The silence in the restaurant felt heavy. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few of them had been quick to judge as well, sneaking glances at Miss Eleanor when she first walked in. Now, those same people couldn't even look her in the eye. The manager tried to recover. Miss Whitmore, I want to personally apologize. This is not the image we want our restaurant to have. Miss Eleanor studied him for a moment. Then what are you going to do about it? The manager cleared his throat. Well, we will ensure all staff undergo proper training to prevent this from happening again. James smirked. Training? He shook his head. You think a seminar is going to fix this? The manager shifted nervously. We take these matters seriously, sir. Then prove it, James said. Because an apology means nothing without action. Miss Eleanor remained calm, but there was a quiet strength in her presence. I want to believe that your restaurant values its customers equally, but tonight showed me otherwise. The manager nodded quickly. I understand. Please, let us make this right. Anything we can do. James leaned forward. Let's start with your hiring and training policies. Do you actively teach your employees to treat all guests with the same level of respect? Or do you let them assume who deserves good service? The manager hesitated. James continued. Because if this is how your employees behave when they think no one important is watching, then you don't have a restaurant problem. You have a culture problem. A few guests murmured in agreement. The tension in the room shifted, not just discomfort, but realization. Miss Eleanor smiled. You see, young man, I don't need to be treated like royalty. I don't need special treatment, but I do expect kindness. And that expectation shouldn't depend on who I am. It should be standard for everyone who walks through these doors. The waiter swallowed hard. I truly am sorry. Miss Eleanor nodded. I hope so. And I hope the next time you see an elderly woman walk into this restaurant, you treat her with the respect she deserves, without needing to know her name first. The manager straightened. Miss Whitmore, we will be making immediate changes to ensure this never happens again. You have my word. James smirked. We'll be watching. Miss Eleanor gave a polite nod. Good. With that, they turned to leave. But this time, as they walked toward the exit, the energy in the room was different. The same guests who had ignored Miss Eleanor when she arrived now watched her in awe. Some nodded in silent respect. Others looked down, ashamed for not speaking up sooner. And the waiter? He just stood there, looking like he wished he could undo every word he had spoken that night. But the truth was, some mistakes couldn't be erased. Some had to be learned. James and Miss Eleanor walked out of the restaurant, the evening air cool against their faces. But something had shifted. Not just in the restaurant, but in the people who had witnessed what happened. Inside, the waiter stood frozen, replaying his own actions in his head. He had walked into work that evening believing he knew how to judge people, that he could decide who deserved respect and who didn't. But he had been wrong. The same woman he had looked down on was the very reason he had a job in the first place. She had built something he had taken for granted. James exhaled, shaking his head. I still can't believe it. Miss Eleanor smiled softly. Believe it? Because it happens all the time. James turned to her. You knew, didn't you? The moment we walked in, you could tell how he saw you. She nodded. I've been alive long enough to recognize it immediately. James clenched his jaw. Why didn't you say anything? Miss Eleanor's smile didn't fade. Because I wanted to see how far he would take it. Sometimes people don't realize who they are until they are forced to face themselves. James let that sink in. She continued, her voice calm but firm. You see, son, this isn't just about one bad waiter. It's about a mindset that runs deeper than we like to admit. It's about how often people are judged before they even speak. How some are welcomed while others are questioned. And the sad part, James glanced at her. What? She sighed. It's so normal that most people don't even notice it. James thought about the other guests in the restaurant. The ones who had ignored what was happening. The ones who had looked away, who had stayed quiet because it wasn't their problem. But when the truth came out, their faces had changed. Some of them had even looked ashamed. James shook his head. They only cared when they found out who you were. Miss Eleanor nodded. That's how it always is. A long pause stretched between them. Then James smirked. I bet that waiter is still standing there, wondering how he messed up so badly. Miss Eleanor chuckled. Good. Maybe he'll think twice next time. James exhaled. I just wish there was a way to make sure this doesn't happen again. Miss Eleanor turned to him. There is. James raised an eyebrow. How? She smiled. By making sure people talk about it. By making sure we don't let these moments pass without calling them out. By reminding people that respect should never be given based on appearances. It should be given because we're all human. James thought about that. Then he nodded. You're right. They kept walking, the night settling around them. Inside the restaurant, the manager was already making phone calls, talking about immediate policy changes. The guests, who had once ignored the situation, sat in silence, reflecting. And the waiter, he wasn't smirking anymore. Tonight, he had learned a lesson he would never forget. Respect should not be a privilege reserved for a select few. It should not be based on wealth, appearance, or status. It should be the standard for everyone. Tonight, a waiter learned that lesson the hard way. But the real question is, how many people never get the chance to teach it? James and Miss Eleanor's story is not unique. Every day, people are judged before they even speak, ignored because of how they look, treated differently because of assumptions, and most of the time there's no dramatic reveal, no justice, just silence. But what if we changed that? What if, instead of looking away, we spoke up? What if we refused to let disrespect slide, no matter who it was happening to? Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever seen someone get treated unfairly? Maybe you've even experienced it yourself. What did you do? And what would you do differently now? Share your story in the comments. Your words could inspire someone to stand up the next time they see injustice. And if you believe that respect should be given to everyone, not just those who look important, then hit like, share this story, and subscribe for more powerful content, because change doesn't start with policies. It starts with people, and it starts with you.